Okay, today I'm delighted to be joined by Rupert Read. Thank you for joining us today, Rupert.
Pleasure.
Rupert is co-director of the Climate Majority Project, emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia, but probably best known as the face of Extinction Rebellion in its heyday. His new book, co-authored with Morgan Phillips, is called Transformative Adaptation.
And I have a copy of it here.
Fantastic.
Ta-da!
But before we dig into that, I always like to ask my guests where this journey started for them. So, what triggered your environmental activism?
Mm. Yeah, well, that's a big question and a long story. I could take you right back into my childhood and my love for the coast and my love for the English Lake District and for birds and animals and my childhood activism as someone who was determined to clean places up that were littered, which absolutely shouldn't have been.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of more recent years, it's really been a kind of gathering, which is, as I see it, kind of proceeded in tandem with the times, if you understand me.
Yeah.
In other words, as over a long period, things have, on balance, gradually got worse. I've gradually got more and more committed. So now I've quit academia and I'm working more or less full time for the Climate Majority Project. And yeah, I guess I wish more people would do things that are similar to what I've done. But also, of course, crucial to the ideas of the Climate Majority Project, maybe we'll get into this,
Yeah.
is that we think that people need to do what they can where they are. That for a lot of people, the best way to proceed to make a real difference in the world is to stay doing what they're doing, but to do it in a genuinely climate and nature positive way. And that's what I think, for example, quite a lot of business people should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. But obviously, you were a professor of philosophy. Was there a trigger that sort of got you into activism, or is it, as you say, has it just been a natural progression of your childhood interests?
Yeah, I did my PhD in the United States at Rutgers University, and the experience of being living in the US for several years kind of radicalized me in the sense that I saw the kind of future that we were heading towards and saw how terrible it was in terms of the environmental devastation and also socioeconomic, cultural, political devastation of a thoroughly capitalized, if you will, country. And when I came back to the UK after finishing my PhD and started teaching philosophy, I was already always committed then to political action, to activism, etc. But the interesting thing that happened while I was at UEA, at the University of East Anglia for many years, was that gradually these two kind of separate sides of my life kind of came together. In other words, my political action and activism and my philosophical work gradually kind of came together. My philosophical work became more about the ecological predicament, and my political work became more informed by, I like to think, quite deep reflection on our situation and where we are and where we're headed. And it was that kind of confluence that made it possible, I guess, for me to become a sort of public intellectual as from about 10 years ago. And in that context, to play a role, for example, in helping to shape the course of Extinction Rebellion in its first couple of years, and that has now been the background for the theory of change that we've developed in the Climate Majority Project and the work that we've developed around transformative and strategic adaptation.
Yeah, well, Extinction Rebellion sort of ushered in a new era of environmental activism.
Yeah.
Did you feel that was just of its time, that was required, or it was, again, a natural progression from your, because I understand you were a councillor for the Green Party for was it 7 years? Sort of, I suppose, more traditional political route? Was it, was the more radical approach, did you feel that was necessary at the time?
Well, that question really takes us to the transformation in my own life, which occurred around 2015, 2016, which just happened to be the time when the world's climate started really spinning out of control as well. So as you say, I was busy with various kinds of conventional activism and doing some good work getting this and that done through the Green Party. When one day I was delivering Green Party leaflets and I was walking down the street and I was noticing the gardens, and the gardens, there would be a garden which had been paved over. Then the next garden had maybe an abandoned sofa or fridge in it. The next garden was very, very neat, but it was so neat that you could tell that lots of weed killer and whatever was being used on the flower beds. And the words came into my head, "This civilization is finished," which was a bit of a body blow. And I stopped delivering the leaflets and thought, where's this come from? Is this true? Is this something I have to think about? Have I been sort of living a kind of fantasy that we can kind of reform our civilizational trajectory and make everything fine? And so I started reflecting on this quite deeply. I spent, over a year thinking about it really and writing about it, sharing my writings privately with some colleagues because I was very nervous about this new idea. I thought, is this going to sound to people like doomerism or defeatism? Eventually, this turned into my talk, This Civilization is Finished, which went viral in 2018, and into my little book, This Civilization is Finished, which is still my most popular book. And it's very important to understand that the meaning of this phrase, it doesn't mean everything is f***ed or we're doomed or whatever. What it means is we cannot go on as we are doing. And if there is any chance of us avoiding a complete collapse, we have to transform everything. We have to undergo transformative adaptation. We have to undergo a butterfly-like transformation, as I sometimes put it. So that was the frame of mind I was in, and that was the writing and the speaking that I was doing around about 2016, 2017, 2018, i.e. in the period that led up to the birth of Extinction Rebellion. I talk about all of this if anyone wants more detail in my book, Do You Want to Know the Truth? So I was sort of on the same track, if you will, as those people who were founding Extinction Rebellion in early 2018. And when I heard about them, I instantly thought, oh my God, this is great, because here's some people who've got the same analysis as me, but they also have a plan. And I joined in with delivering the plan, which for the first several months through the April Rebellion in 2019 basically worked. And we did effect a change in the national conversation. But again, to come to your question, Gareth, I think that the change that was made was to some extent of its time. It couldn't just go on. We couldn't just go on doing the same thing as before. So in 2020, along with a bunch of others, I started getting more serious about my transformative adaptation work and about the work of discussing and agitating for what was then called a new moderate flank in environmental action and activism. And that is what has eventually become the Climate Majority Project.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's a good time then for you to explain what the Climate Majority Project is.
Yeah. So the Climate Majority Project, their fundamental idea is there is a majority of people who are already concerned about our situation. That's clear from opinion polls. They're not mostly concerned enough, and they're not mostly doing very much about it. So what people need, as we see it, is they need more truth, but they need help in handling that truth. We need to process the difficult emotions that are aroused by climate truth together. They crucially need pathways to action, meaningful forms of agency, along with other people to be, if you will, laid out and certainly joined up. And that's one of the things we're trying to do in the Climate Majority Project. We're trying to name this moment and name the phenomenon that is needed, and to provide people with a sense of, look, you're part of something along with loads of other people who are feeling the same way and who are starting to take action where they live, where they pray, where they work, in their professions, etc. So the fundamental idea of the Climate Majority Project is, if you will, to take the kind of impetus that's there in organizations like Extinction Rebellion, but mainstream that, make it genuinely accessible to the majority, the silent and relatively inactive majority. And that is our great hope. It's probably a long shot, but it's the best shot we've got. If there is going to be a future, it's going to be because most people insist that change occurs, and they start to bring that change in their lives. And I don't just mean their private individual lives. I don't just mean as a consumer. I mean in your lives as part of a community, or as part of your business, or in your workplace, or in your profession. And those kinds of changes need to be occurring and understood as occurring. There needs to be more collective awareness. And again, we're trying to provide some of that. So that's kind of our theory of change, that what is needed is truthfulness, which includes truthfulness about how awful the situation is and therefore how adaptation is now very much crucial. Help in processing those difficult truths, pathways to agency together, which are genuinely welcoming and encompassing, and a collective awareness of all of this, including, crucially, of the reality that more and more people are waking up into this space. And so there is an inevitable movement or wave, as I sometimes call it, a wave of action developing here. The only questions are, is it going to be fast enough? Is it going to be deep enough? Is it going to be wise enough? And those are the questions we're trying to help answer in the affirmative.
Yeah, it seems a different approach from Extinction Rebellion, which is about, giving people a shock, and working with them. But how does it manifest itself in practice? How do you reach out into those communities?
Yeah. So this is an immensely complex question of necessity because it's variegated, because it's distributed. So this is going to be a distributed wave of action taking place in all these different domains that I've started to name. But let me seek to give you some examples to give listeners an idea of it. So one of the things we do in the Climate Majority Project is we incubate organizations that we think are especially promising in the space. So in the past, we've incubated, for example, Community Climate Action, which is about mainly rural communities seeking to work to adapt and mitigate and grow food and so forth where they are. We've also incubated an organization called Lawyers for Net Zero, now called General Counsel Sustainability Forum. So this is working with senior corporate lawyers who are trying to do the right thing in their organizations to elicit climate action. So senior corporate lawyers on the one hand, people living and working on the land on the other hand, very, very different, but all pointing in the same direction, right? That's the point. So now, for example, we incubate an organization called Cadence Roundtable, which is about taking adaptation seriously and about helping professionals to do that. We've helped to incubate an organization called Teach the Future, which is engaged in seeking to get climate education seriously available in schools. These are all what we see as important potential leverage points. And that relates to one of the other main things that we do, which is when we don't see an organization which is kind of stepping up into doing something important and necessary, which is a potential big leverage point, then we try to do that ourselves. So we run campaigns. So, for instance, we have the Climate Courage campaign, which is about seeking to resource children and students, and in fact, ultimately everybody, to handle the difficult truth and face it with courage. And we have the Regulate Us campaign, the campaign which is most directed towards the potential role of business in all of this. So the Regulate Us campaign is basically urging business people to say, look, we haven't got this. We can't sort this. Business is regarded as very important in our society and as having quite a lot of power. And of course, in a way it does. But it does not have the power to do things which ultimately, to some extent, are things which society has to decide to do, which government has to bring in via regulation. So we're saying that one of the key things that businesses need to do is to admit that difficult truth and to call on government and politicians and so forth to regulate them better, to regulate them with climate and nature and adaptation in mind. And so we work with the business people who are willing to move into that kind of state of not just kind of saying, we can make huge progress on this by going net zero in our own production and our own individual business, but recognizing that bad actors will always drive out good actors in business if we don't have the right regulatory framework in place. For example, ultimately, there's going to need to be something like a progressive carbon tax if we're going to actually enable business and innovators to do what they do so well and take us in the direction of an economy which could actually be compatible with the future.
Yeah, and I think we're moving neatly on to the book. So, how would you define transformative adaptation?
Yeah, so transformative adaptation is climate adaptation. So response to impacts, response to our vulnerabilities, which are growing all the time now, as we've seen, for example, these horrendous floods all over the world in the last few months. Responding to those impacts and adapting to that new situation that we're in a way which is actually transformative and strategic and sufficient unto the day. So most of the discourse in activism, in politics, in business so far has been about net zero, has been about decarbonisation, has been about so-called mitigation. Part of what we're saying in the Climate Majority Project is, sadly, it's now too late for that to be the main focus. We need to integrate adaptation thoroughly into the situation because there's no longer a possibility of heading off severe impacts. They are here and they are going to worsen for a very long time to come. So we have to take adaptation seriously. But what it means to take adaptation seriously is not just to take it narrowly and defensively, shallowly, incrementally in the way that has mostly been taken so far. So to give an example in relation to flooding, if you're thinking about how to adapt to flooding, the shallow defensive way to do it is, well, obviously we just need to dredge the river and build higher hard flood defenses and get the water out as quickly as possible. If you're thinking in a transformative and strategic way about what it is to adapt to our new reality, you will ask questions like, well, hang on a minute. Why are we getting quite so much water as we are getting? Of course, part of it is simply because of getting bigger storms, but it's also because we've got terrible upland land management. It's also because we've got terrible farming practices. It's also because we've stripped out so many of the marshes, wetlands, and peatlands. Mm-hmm. So a transformative approach to adaptation and a strategic approach says, let's think about this a bit more systemically and holistically. Let's go upstream. Let's look at all the ways in which we can act to buffer the impacts here, to make them less bad, even before we get to the crucial point of being able to take out the root causes through decarbonizing, etc. So transformative adaptation is adaptation which is actually adequate to our situation, which seeks to transform our society in the direction it needs to transform in any way, which seeks to be compatible with decarbonization, whereas a lot of shallow adaptation is very high carbon and is bad from a decarbonization perspective. Transformative adaptation is the kind of adaptation that we most essentially need. And the struggle to define the kind of adaptation, the kind of adaptation that we're going to get adequately is, we say, a key struggle in the coming period of time. If what we do in response to impacts is either nothing or merely shallow defensive adaptation, then ultimately we're getting more and more fragile. If what we do is transformative adaptation, and of course that's sometimes going to involve hard flood defenses, for example, but that won't be all the time. Much more often it will involve something more creative, more upstream, more holistic. If what we do is transformative adaptation, well, then we actually have a chance of getting through what is coming.
Yeah, it's always struck me that adaptation is sort of almost at the green bling stage that we were with mitigation, in that, you know, almost every city will have one rain garden somewhere.
Right.
Yeah. You know, it's like David Cameron putting a wind turbine on the corner of his house, a tiny one, just and so I suppose what you're talking about is step changes in adaptation rather
absolutely
than little tweaks.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we're calling for in the Climate Majority Project is a national adaptation plan. There is a so-called National Adaptation Programme, but it's not remotely serious. It's been slammed by the Committee on Climate Change, and hardly anyone's heard of it. We need a proper, fully resourced national adaptation plan. And this ought to become, in the terms of this government we have now, this ought to become a mission of the government. And we argue further that unless you have this mission, then all your other missions are moot. They're all potentially going to be swept aside, literally swept aside potentially. Yeah. In terms of your point about green bling, absolutely. We need to have a step change that puts transformative adaptation in the driving seat. The kind of thing that would mean in cities, for example, in relation to the flooding threat. is cities need to become what's called sponge cities. So you need to be thinking not just of one rain garden, but of the whole thing holistically. As how do we help here in the city itself to absorb the rain when it comes, as opposed to just kind of flushing it straight out into flash floods. One reason why it's crucial for businesses to think about this is that if you don't, then sooner or later you're not going to have any clients or customers or workers, because they're going to get knocked out. They're going to get derailed by these kinds of impacts, or they're going to get bankrupted. So that's one of the ways of putting it quite bluntly, as a kind of existential challenge for businesses. Businesses are going to need to be involved in thinking about the implementation of the adaptation challenge, both in terms of their own narrow interest, in terms of things like thinking about, for example, what are the vulnerabilities of my supply line, but also, again, more holistically in this kind of transformative or strategic way, in terms of let's think about the kind of the whole kind of chain connection of the economy here, and let's think about what it actually means to make it more circular. And part of what it necessarily means now is this kind of holistic adaptation thinking, without which, as I say, we're at risk, and at growing risk, of being in one way or another swept away. And of course, it's not just flooding. We're also talking about the risk of wildfires, about the risk of heat waves. We're talking also about the risk, by the way, of extreme cold or cold snaps. You might be thinking, some viewers might be thinking, oh, well, isn't that a risk of the past? You know, we never have white Christmases anymore, et cetera, et cetera. But what's just coming onto people's radars now is that there is a severe risk, ironically, because of the enormous Arctic flood melt and Greenland melt. There is a severe risk now of massive disruption to Atlantic currents, including what's called the Gulf Stream, which everyone's heard of. If that occurs, Britain's climate could, over the next generation, be knocked back into a much colder climate. So we need to be ready to adapt to more chaotic weather, to hotter weather, and potentially over time to colder weather. It's very, very challenging, but that is precisely the challenge that we need to rise to. That is reality now.
Yeah. I was just thinking when you were talking about that, you know, you've made it very clear that this is adaptation and mitigation. And you make it clear in the book that you're not talking about giving up on mitigation. You just that the impacts are hitting now, so we need to adapt as well as mitigate. But is there a risk that this could feed into the sort of so-called lukewarmer community who say, oh, climate change is being exaggerated, so we just need to adapt to the impacts? You know, how do you keep both balls in the air at the same time in terms of when I say public attention, I mean sort of policymaker attention?
Yeah, that's a fair question and a very important question. But look, here's my answer. If we don't take adaptation sufficiently seriously, then we are leaving the field open to those people, to the discredited lukewarmers and the right-wingers who say, oh, we can just adapt, right? Part of what it is to take adaptation seriously and holistically and strategically is to be clear about what we can do and to be clear about the limits to what we can do. There are limits to adaptation, but we cannot leave the field to these other people to have their made up nonsense about how we can just adapt. And when they say we can just adapt, typically what they mean is we can just do shallow defensive adaptation.
Yeah.
And as I've already implied earlier, and as we detail in the book, if all you do is shallow defensive adaptation, you are fragilizing yourself further. Eventually, those higher flood defenses or whatever are going to be overtopped because the climate doesn't stop coming at you, right? We have to do adaptation in a way which is compatible with the decarbonisation mission, and that is possible. That is what transformative adaptation is. And we have to take both seriously. And if we do not take the adaptation part of the challenge sufficiently seriously, we are leaving the adaptation debate to bad actors and nefarious voices. That's why I say we must enter into this discussion, this debate of seeking to define adaptation adequately. We actually have to take on the people who are saying, oh, we can just adapt, and talk about adaptation in a positive way, but in a different way. Yeah, I think that that's really the crucial point here, and it literally is a crucial point. It's a really serious mistake at this point to think something like, "Ooh, well, because of those risks, we're just going to downplay adaptation." No, on the contrary, we need to upplay it. We need to take ownership of it.
Mm-hmm.
We, if you will, need to be the people who are looked to in relation to adaptation. I mean, how is it actually going to play out in the next few years? So here's roughly how I see it. I think that what is highly likely is that one way or another, there will be increasing attention paid to vulnerability and impacts and adaptation over the next several years. It probably won't be enough, but it will be there and it will grow and grow. Initially, the form that a lot of that will take will be quite narrow-minded. It will be unenlightened. It will be shallow and defensive adaptation. What we need to do from the beginning is try to put as much of that as possible in the broader context of transformative and strategic adaptation approaches. And we need to challenge people who are seeking to make adaptation only a shallow defensive response. And bring these broader, more systemic considerations constantly into the debate. And I think if we do that, and as we do that, then over time we can potentially win that debate. And more the form of adaptation that is taken will be decarbonisation compatible. It will be transformative and strategic. So that's the kind of game as I see it unfolding, if you will, over the next 5 to 10 years. It is a very, very important game because the stakes include the lives, not to mention the prosperity of many of us.
Yes. Well, I suppose looking at the doomer end of it, if you live in the Maldives or Bangladesh or other low-lying countries, presumably there's a limit to what transformative adaptation can do to help. You know.
Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Like I say, adaptation has its limits. There are part of what we're going to need to do sometimes is to relocate people. And by the way, that isn't just for the so-called global South. That's going to happen increasingly in this country as well. It's already happening, in fact, in a place like Fairborn in Wales. It's on the cusp of happening. In Bude, in Cornwall, in parts of East Norfolk, where I live. In future years, it will probably start to happen in places like West Norfolk, places like Kings Lynn, possibly ultimately even places like Cambridge and Ely. You look at those long-term sea level rise maps, and it's pretty grim viewing, frankly. If you look into the future of London, the future of London is far more in doubt than most people seem to have realized as yet, because it's probable that we're already committed, tragically, over the long view, over the next few centuries, to up to about 10 meters of sea level rise. Now, even if there is a new Thames flood barrier, it probably can't cope with much more than another 5 meters of sea level rise. So what this means is we have probably already lost London. It's probably gone within a couple of centuries. The future history of London is with virtual certainty shorter than the past history of London. Now, these kinds of timelines are beyond the ken, perhaps, of most people, but there are people, long-term planners, engineers, civil servants, etc., whose job it is to think about these things. And actually, we all ought to think about them more. The more we think in a genuinely long-term way, obviously, the better for the long-term prosperity of humanity. So what I'm saying is, we need to be very serious, yes, about the limits to adaptation. And sometimes what you have to do is what's called deep adaptation, also discussed in the book and that I've written about extensively in the past. And deep adaptation is adaptation to collapse. And collapse may occur at scale, but collapse is bound to occur, if you will, at a small scale for communities like Fairborn or the Maldive Islands. These already have tragically their death warrants written. And humanity has to figure out how to deal with those certain coming collapses. That's another form of adaptation. That's deep adaptation. That's adaptation that responds to the likelihood or certainty in some cases of partial or total societal collapse. But the point about transformative adaptation and why I think this is an exciting, positive agenda and why I am hopeful, as I say, that over the next 5 to 10 years, it will increasingly become the agenda here, The point about transformative adaptation is that it's a positive vision, despite the awesomely dire and difficult dilemmas we find ourselves in. It's a positive vision for how we can transform and adapt to what's coming. It's not unrealistic. On the contrary, it's absolutely reality-based. It's not toxically positive. It's reality-based. It's ecosystem-based. It's a way in which we can envision a future which might not involve collapse, and we can actually aim for it and start to achieve it.
Yeah. It always strikes me as one of the challenges with adaptation is that, and you mentioned this before in terms of the water management in a catchment area is, and you'll appreciate this having been a councillor, as local authorities tend to look within the borough boundary. And one example came across recently is I live in the northeast of England. Morpeth, just up the road, has flooding problems. Now, the National Trust at Wallington, I think about 6 or 7 miles upstream of the Wansbeck, have started implementing what they call squidgy bits, marshes and things, and they've introduced beavers, all sorts of things to mitigate flooding on the Wansbeck. But we're sort of beholden then to the National Trust deciding to do that out of the goodness of their heart. Whereas if you think about the people of Morpeth, their insurance companies, all sorts of other actors are the ones who are benefiting from it. And there's a sort of, in some ways, maybe a disconnect between the action that needs to be taken and the impact or the avoided impact it might have. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on trying to align incentives or whether it just has to be a top-down government scheme saying, if you live in certain catchment areas, you must take certain action to protect the people downstream.
Yeah, good. So I think there's a few dimensions here, and if you put them together, then I think we can get somewhere. I would say, yes, some of it needs to be more top down. So we need a national adaptation plan. There are some things that government should mandate. A lot of adaptation, though, is inherently local, in a way that differs really from the logic of decarbonisation, which is inherently a global logic. The adaptation challenge is different in different places. So to give a tiny example, I went to give a talk at Ilkley Climate Action Group in the Yorkshire Moors a few months ago. Excellent local climate action group. And I was looking at it and praising the stuff that they've done. But I pointed out to them that the vast majority of the stuff that they've done is oriented towards decarbonisation, which is fine. But I suggested to them, and they took very well to the suggestion, that actually the challenge now increasingly is one of adaptation. And I urged them to think about what transformative adaptation would mean for them in their locality. Now, one of the things it's going to mean for them in their locality at Ilkley, because of the moor, is wildfire risk and seeking to reduce that. And for example, perhaps to have some kind of citizen monitoring of that risk in the absence of sufficient monitoring of it from those who own the land or from local authorities. So that's an example of the locality of the adaptation challenge. Everywhere is potentially now exposed to wildfire risk, but some places much more than others. Most places are now exposed to flooding risk, but some places much more than others. Adaptation has to be locally responsive and locally figured out. Now, having said that, you're of course right that sometimes those local incentives and disincentives and interests and responsibilities don't align precisely. That, it seems to me, takes us to the general spirit of what I'm trying to bring here and what we're trying to bring. In other words, if we're really going to get where we need to get to in terms of the adaptation challenge, it's going to have to actually enter into people's consciousness. It's going to have to be something that people want to do and spontaneously do. You can do quite a lot through a national adaptation plan if it's properly resourced and a mission. You could do quite a lot through local adaptation plans put in by local councils. You can do quite a lot by organizations, as you put it, by the goodness of their heart, starting to take this on into their interests. But we need to get more and more people to feel it ethically, and we need to get more and more people to feel it as a matter of collective, enlightened self-interest. And if we manage to do that, then we'll really be getting somewhere. That's what we're going to need to do over the next generation if we're not going to be increasingly derailed by what we're going to face. One last point on this. It is important to notice that because of the greater locality of the adaptation challenge and opportunity, that there is an important sense in which adaptation is a way in which is easier for a lot of people than decarbonisation, right? If you're someone who doesn't have a very strong imagination with regard to the future or with regard to the rest of the world, if you're someone who is very, very stretched and stressed in their everyday life, if you're someone who is resource poor or agency poor, if you fall into any of these categories, it is difficult to rise to the challenge of decarbonisation on its own terms, which is an inherently distant, non-tangible, global, long-term predicament. But adaptation doesn't have those kind of features. The way in which the climate problem is, in fact, a predicament and a tragedy has a lot to do with its free rider features, its collective action problem features. But adaptation doesn't have those so much. It's not so long term, it's more short term. It's not so distant, it's more local. It's not so intangible, it's pretty tangible. So this is how we think in the Climate Majority Project, that adaptation is going to be a great way in for a lot of people who've been left out of climate discourse and action to date. And this, you can perhaps see how this is partly how we see strategic adaptation as being, and transformative adaptation as being, a way in which we can mainstream the climate challenge. It's a way in for people. Yeah. And the beautiful thing about it is that focusing on our vulnerabilities, on impacts, on the adaptation challenge is a way of making the whole thing very psychologically real to people. So ultimately, the argument that I'm making in the report that we've been commissioned to write for the Open Society Foundation on strategic adaptation, which will be appearing in 2025, ultimately the key argument I'm making on this front with that report is, if you want to rocket fuel mitigation, decarbonisation, if you want to make that go faster, the best way to do it now probably is by taking adaptation seriously. Mm-hmm. To the extent that we take transformative and strategic adaptation seriously, we alter people's lived reality, and we put a bomb inside their mindsets, which will explode in the best possible way over time. So coming back to what we were talking about earlier, far from accepting the claim that used to be sometimes made that if we focus on adaptation, it will stand in the way of decarbonisation, we now argue the exact opposite. We think now the best possible way now to power the agenda of decarbonisation, which frankly in many places has kind of stalled, is through taking adaptation seriously and taking it in the right way.
Yes, because people can dig or maintain rain gardens, etc. You can get physically involved in it, which always helps. And but to me, a lot of the challenge on this is scale. And 10 years ago, I visited Portland, Oregon, which is notoriously the rainiest rainiest city in the US, and they are leaders on adaptation. They don't just have one rain garden; they have 1,000 drainage swales. Some of them are incredibly simple, just little, just recessing street trees and bushes below the road surface level to allow the water to drain in. And they had a fantastic rule that if you wanted to build in the city centre, you had to deal with all your stormwater on site, which meant that all modern buildings had a garden attached because they couldn't just concrete over everything. So, there were lots of tangible benefits, but when you come back to the UK, we seem to be in the situation we were on renewables, say 20 years ago, where you might occasionally pass a house with a solar panel on it. Or you might occasionally see a wind farm, but you'd go to Europe and there'd be villages covered in solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. We just seem to be quite far behind in a lot of this stuff. So I don't know whether there's mechanisms for speeding it up. I talked before about the disconnect on watersheds, whether there could be more financial incentives for those farmers to provide basically ecosystem
definitely
services, rather than sort of just asking them to to set aside some part of their land to for a wetland to soak up some of that water.
Yeah.
So sorry,
Absolutely,
I don't know where I've got off on a slight tangent there.
No, it's not a tangent at all.
Yeah.
You're exactly right, Gareth. We are way behind on adaptation.
Yeah.
There are places that are leaders. You've mentioned Portland, Oregon. We could talk about places in the global south as well. There is transformative adaptation stuff happening in parts of Nepal. It's been happening in parts of Rojava in North Syria under the incredible pressure that they've been under. There are good examples of adaptation around. There is a pathetic absence of leadership on this in this country. It's truly, truly dire. I mean, a lot of viewers will be thinking, "Oh, we haven't been very good on decarbonisation, really, in this country, have we?" And that's kind of true. But we've been even worse on adaptation. And the subcommittee of the Committee on Climate Change on Adaptation make this very clear. Their reports are absolutely devastating. By the way, one little note here: why is it a subcommittee on adaptation? It's almost like even the Committee on Climate Change in this country puts decarbonisation front and centre and then sort of has adaptation as a kind of sidebar. We need to put adaptation front and centre. It needs to be at least equal now in our consideration with decarbonisation, and they need to go, as you and I have been discussing, they need to go hand in hand. So the situation is dire. It is pathetic. We are way behind the clock. We're going to suffer as a result in the coming years. We've already started suffering. We've seen some of that suffering this autumn in the floods. That is why in the Climate Majority Project and in the strategic adaptation campaign that we're running, we are urging the government now to have a mission which is about climate adaptation, transformative and strategic climate adaptation, while we're urging them to have a national adaptation plan. You are starting to get some politicians speaking out about this. As so often, the pathfinders are in the Green Party. I'm thinking especially of Caroline Lucas, who's working with us now, and Adrian Ramsey, the Green Party leader and new MP. It needs to be mainstreamed much more effectively. You ask, Gareth, what is the mechanism for doing this? I would say we are part of the mechanism. The Climate Majority Project, our strategic adaptation campaign, and the various organizations we are working with, one or two of which I've already mentioned. And there are an increasing number of other organizations and networks stepping into this space. For example, the Network for Social Change is starting to act on this. But it's organizations like us who are the mechanism. This is not going to come from on high. The Labour Party failed to put this as a priority in their manifesto. Their minds need to be changed, and they need to be made to suffer, if you will, the ballot box, etc., if they don't change on this, if they don't take it seriously enough. Because this ultimately is about responsibility to citizens. If we're thinking about the responsibility of government and of policymakers, their ultimate responsibility is to protect their citizens. Mm-hmm. This is about a basic form of protection against what we know is coming. It just isn't good enough to say, well, we've got our missions and we're going to decarbonize electricity supply, so everything's going to be okay. It's absolutely not going to be okay unless we take climate adaptation seriously. So I would urge people to support the work that we're doing, to support the work that others are doing in the climate adaptation space. I would urge people, obviously, to get involved with it themselves, in their businesses, in their professions, in their local communities, wherever you have most potential leverage and capability. We need to embody the mechanism of enabling this kind of change to really begin.
Yeah. And going back to something you mentioned before about global supply chains and putting that together with my rambling on the incentives to act. Is there scope to get investment into, producer companies in the global south by getting industry to fund adaptation in those countries out of their own self-interest? Whether they're producing coffee or even palm oil, whatever it might be. I'm just wondering if there's not even an overall mechanism, but if that's an opportunity, to communicate to these huge industries, particularly in the food sector, that their supply chain will be impacted by extreme weather all over the world. So they may have to look at investing in those countries, whether it's the book mentions mangrove, restoring mangroves, etc. In order to do that.
Yes.
I don't know if you've any thoughts or whether
I
there's
definitely
work
think
going on
that's
in that
right.
way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it starts with businesses asking questions like, how vulnerable is our supply chain? And is it likely that it's actually a lot more vulnerable than we've as yet realized? How vulnerable are our premises? How vulnerable are our employees? How vulnerable are our customers? And you kind of work out, how vulnerable are the institutions of our society or other societies which we are dependent on for parts of our supply chain, etc., etc. All of these questions need to be asked, and if you ask them seriously, they will start to lead towards, frankly, a step change.
Are you aware of any organizations who are thinking in those directions, or
Not a lot, frankly. The basic situation we're in, and I assume this is part of the sort of place you're coming from in your podcast, is that there is quite a lot of awareness and discourse and, some insufficient, but some action now on trying to attain net zero goals and of placing decarbonisation high on institutional agendas, on political agendas, not high enough, but you get the idea. Adaptation is the poor relation. And as you were implying, I think, a few minutes ago, it is in our enlightened self-interest to take adaptation a lot more seriously. Think about this, for example, from the perspective of migration and refugees. So we mentioned that there are inevitably going to be some climate refugees. But if we want to stop there being migratory pressures, which will make the patterns of migration that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years look small. If we want to stop that from happening, one of the most important things we need to do is to adequately fund and support adaptation in countries in the global south. For example, and this is a really important example, there are many cities now which are becoming, frankly, quite unpleasant to live in, quite unlivable, because for parts of the year, it's not just they're horribly polluted, it's just that the sheer heat island effect is so ghastly that it's hard for people to work outside, it's hard for them to sleep, etc. It would be quite possible for a relatively modest investment to do a huge amount to green a lot of those cities, to put in place infrastructure, by which I mean things like trees and gardens and channels and so forth, infrastructure that will actually significantly lower the ambient temperatures in those places. So we're looking at global temperature rises right now of 1.5 degrees centigrade. On land, that's often 2 to 2.5 degrees. And people sometimes say, those sound like relatively small numbers. Well, we're seeing the damage that can already do in terms of impacts. And we're starting to see some of the damage it can do in terms of heat. But if you effectively green cities, you can produce ambient temperature reductions, not just of 2.5 degrees, but of 8 degrees or 10 degrees or 12 degrees even in extreme cases. Just by doing simple things like putting trees in down a street, you can sometimes have a reduction in several degrees of ambient temperature. Now that makes an enormous difference to quality of life and to livability. So to anyone thinking even remotely rationally in terms of our enlightened self-interest, in terms of supporting others and making sure that those others don't feel that they have to come knocking on our door in vast numbers in the future, that kind of investment in adaptation makes enormous sense. The resources are really not there yet. The COP process is failing us on this. We need to find new ways of enabling this to go forward. One possibility could be through international diplomacy by way of climate clubs, i.e. coalitions of the willing, who are willing to go further, not just on decarbonisation, but also on adaptation and, of course, loss and damage and compensation for the storms that are occurring in these places, etc. And it would, as I say, be in our enlightened self-interest to do that. But yes, as you were implying, I think there is a huge potential opportunity, which to my knowledge is virtually unexploited yet, for businesses to also start thinking into and stepping into this space. There has been, in my view, too much effort focused from businesses on how do we seek to do stuff which decarbonizes our own individual company, not enough that looks at decarbonization across the whole society or economy, and absolutely not enough that looks at putting adaptation right up there with decarbonization.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for that. I think that's given me huge amounts of food for thought. My ideas are bouncing about my brain, but we're running towards the end of it. But maybe just to finish, quick plug for your book again. Is it available in all good bookshops? Or
well, as they say, yes, also available online, direct from Permanent Press, the Transformative Adaptation book. The same with the Climate Majority Project book. You can get that from London Publishing Partnership, for example, or you can get that via the Climate Majority website, which is climatemajorityproject.com. So yeah, do go on there and have a look around, and do sign up for email updates, etc. if you like what you've been hearing.
Fantastic, because it clearly is still the Cinderella of the climate debate, and I agree 100% with you that we have to do both. We can't get away with either or in this one.
Yeah, and the potentialities, if we do both, as we've been discussing, are actually genuinely exciting. This is now, I passionately believe, the way that in the teeth of this terrible, endless storm that we've accidentally created for ourselves, this is the way we can actually really get somewhere on it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Rupert. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Cheers, Gareth.